Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week we have a question from Tiffany. Let's give it a listen. This episode of Revolution Health Radio is brought to you by 144.me. 144 is a diet and lifestyle reset program I created to help you dial in the 4 pillars of health: nutrition, physical activity, sleep, and stress management. Whether you want to lose weight, boost your energy, treat a chronic health problem, or just maintain your current good health and extend your lifespan, these are the 4 areas you need to focus on before anything else. In the 144 program, I walk you through every step of the process, from cleaning out your pantry and shopping for the right foods, to recipe and meal plans, to video demos of workouts that you can do at home without any special equipment, to guided meditation and stress management programs, to daily sleep tips, to personalized recommendations for what to do after you finish the reset. 144 is a great option whether you're just getting started with this stuff or you've been on the path for a while. In fact, I do a 144 myself 3 or 4 times a year to hit the reset button and give myself a boost. To learn more about how 144 can help you achieve your health goals, head over to 144.me. Okay, now back to the show.
Hi, Chris. My name is Tiffany Hill. My 11-year-old son has been identified as a dyslexic learner, as well as having inattentive ADHD. I too suspect that I have inattentive ADHD given his behaviors and symptoms and diagnosis. I am curious to know what protocol you recommend for children and adults identified as having inattentive ADHD, whether through diet, supplementation, or other interventions. My son is about to go on a medication trial prescription for his ADHD, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about prescription medication as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for sending in your question, Tiffany. You know, I get this question a lot because the incidence of ADHD has risen so dramatically over the past decade. According to the CDC, ADHD now affects 11% of kids, which is a 42% increase over just the last 8 years alone. About 6% of kids now are taking medication for ADHD, and males are 3 times more likely than females to be diagnosed. So this is clearly a big issue. It's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And if you've been following my work for some time, then you'll recognize right off the bat that this dramatic increase over the past 8 years, 42% increase, could not be related to genetic factors alone because our genes simply don't change that quickly. So we know that there are some environmental factors that are contributing to this increase in ADHD, which is interesting because if you look at conventional sources, if you do some searching on Dr. Google, for the causes of ADHD, and you click on some mainstream website links and read what they have to say, they'll tell you that there is genetic predisposition, but otherwise there aren't any real known causes. And they actually, some sites will go out of their way to say that diet has never been shown to be a cause. So here we have the fact that ADHD has risen in incidence by almost 50% over the last 8 years. And on the other hand, we have mainstream organizations telling us that environmental factors are not playing a significant role, at least diet, which is pretty ridiculous in my opinion. And there actually is quite a bit of evidence that suggests that diet, at least indirectly, is a major contributing factor, as well as many other environmental factors. This is yet another example of where the conventional medical establishment is out of sync, even with its own research, even with peer-reviewed, published research over the past 10 to 20 years that has a lot to say about what some of the non-genetic causes of ADHD may be. And I think that genetics are likely to play a relatively small role in these conditions, along with every other chronic condition. They certainly play a role in terms of predisposition, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But genes are not driving this condition, and that should be obvious given the dramatic increase just in the last 8 years. So ADHD is a huge topic. I would take lots of podcasts to cover it in depth, but I just want to summarize a recent theory Actually, this paper that I'm going to talk about was published about autism spectrum disorder, and they advanced a kind of systems theory or holistic theory that incorporates a lot of different risk factors and mechanisms. And the paper is called Enteric Ecosystem Disruption in Autism Spectrum Disorder: Can the Microbiota and Macrobiota be Restored? So obviously ADHD and autism spectrum disorder is not the same thing, but the reason I bring this up is I believe that ADHD and ASD actually share some similar mechanisms. And just as, in the same way, autism for many years, it was like, oh, we don't know what's causing it. There must be some genetic factors, and clearly something is going wrong because the incidence of autism has risen dramatically over the past several years as well. And so there must be some environmental thing, but we don't really know what it is. And diet's never been proven to play a role. So it's a lot of the same factors. But what ADHD and ASD share in common, of course, is that the brain is not working properly. We know that it's not natural for the brain to function in such a way that it leads to ADHD and ASD. And even though these aren't the same conditions, we know that they share that similar fundamental imbalance in the brain. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a recent paper that was published, and I think it's relevant to ADHD, although ADHD was not the subject of the paper. This paper was actually looking at what causes autism spectrum disorder, and it had a very interesting title. It was called Enteric Ecosystem Disruption in Autism Spectrum Disorder: Can the Microbiota and Macrobiota be Restored? Of course, ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, are not the same thing, but I believe they do share a common etiology or common set of causes. What they share in common is that the brain is not working properly. And the particular manifestation of how the brain is malfunctioning is different in ADHD and ASD, but I think they do share a lot of similar mechanisms, and that's why I'd like to take a look at this paper as a way of getting into talking about some of the things that I investigate when I work with kids with ADHD. So the authors talk about what they call the biome depletion hypothesis and the 3-hit paradigm in this paper. So the 3 hits are, number 1, biome depletion. We're going to talk about each of these a little more in a second. Number 2, an environmental stimulus. And number 3, genetic or epigenetic predisposition. So the biome depletion hypothesis suggests that alterations of the microbiome are a consequence of our increasing hygiene and the resulting eradication of helminths, parasites, and other organisms that we co-evolve with over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, that help regulate and stabilize our immune system. And the loss of these organisms has been suggested to contribute to not only autoimmune conditions, but also conditions like autism spectrum disorder and possibly ADHD. Because the microbiome works with the other legs of the stool, if you will, of the body to promote stability of the whole body's ecosystem and immune function. And so the idea here is that changes to our environment disrupt the microbiome in a way that leads to lack of immune competence, and that in turn affects the brain and can increase the risk of autoimmune disease, autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, and a whole bunch of other problems. So hit number 2 is environmental stimulus, and this is a very long list of possible contributing factors, but they would include things like poor diet, excess consumption of refined and processed foods, including sugar, vitamin D deficiency, excess exposure to antibiotics, acetaminophen exposure. Acetaminophen is used quite a bit in kids, and there's actually some fairly alarming research suggesting that it can be a contributor to autism spectrum disorders and possibly ADHD via similar mechanisms. And if these environmental stimuli happen at critical times during brain development early in a kid's life, then they can have long-lasting effects. And then hit number 3 is genetic and or epigenetic predisposition. So, obviously not all kids have ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, even if they have microbiota depletion and environmental stimuli, like I just mentioned. So why do some kids get it and the other kids don't? Well, that's where genetics and epigenetics come in. They do play a role in terms of predisposing how kids that are exposed to these triggers are going to respond. One child might develop autism spectrum disorder. Another kid might develop ADHD. Another kid might develop an autoimmune disease like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis or something else. So there are a variety of ways in which these triggers can manifest in terms of symptoms, and that's determined primarily by genetic and epigenetic factors. So another interesting theory that the researchers mentioned is the propionic acid theory. So this suggests that disturbances in the gut microbiota lead to increased production of a short-chain fatty acid called propionic acid. And there's different short-chain fatty acids. There's propionic acid, there's butyrate, and they have different impacts. Butyrate is anti-inflammatory and immunoregulatory. It plays a role in supporting the immune system. Propionic acid, on the other hand, when it is found in excess, can alter metabolic and immune pathways, gene expressions, and synaptic plasticity in a way that's consistent with the findings of autism spectrum disorder and other brain disorders. And some of the people that are studying these theories, like Derek McFabe, who's in Toronto, I believe, have performed some very interesting experiments where they infuse propionic acid into the brain of rats or mice, and those animals then exhibit behavior that is very consistent with autism spectrum disorder models. And so, this is probably another mechanism by which disruption of the gut flora leads to changes in brain function, including, autism spectrum disorder-like behaviors and ADHD-like behaviors. And then the third theory that they mention is the cell danger response. So this is something that has been put forward by a researcher in San Diego, I think at UCSD, named Robert Navio. And this refers to an adaptive response by the cell to a perceived threat. So adaptive responses are normal responses. They're appropriate, especially in short-term response to a particular threat. But all adaptive responses, if they become stuck or chronic, can cause problems. So an example would be the stress response. The stress response is very helpful when we're exposed to a threat because this fight or flight response helps us to either run away or fight if we need to when we're faced with a stress. If you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, if we're out on the savannah walking and we get confronted by a lion or a predator, our heart rate will increase, blood flow to the muscles will increase, oxygenation increases, all of the things that would help us to survive that immediate threat. And so that's adaptive. That's a smart thing that the body does. But if that fight or flight response becomes chronic, as it does, as it has in the modern world, where that stress system is continually activated, then something that was adaptive in the short or immediate term can become maladaptive over the long term and cause a lot of problems. So the cell danger response is a similar kind of situation where you have an adaptive, positive short or immediate term response that happens in the cell that has become chronic. And what this does is causes changes in mitochondrial function, oxygen consumption, redox metabolism, membrane fluidity, lipid dynamics, protein folding, vitamin availability, metal homeostasis, a whole bunch of other aspects that are related to cellular function. And, cells are the scaffolding of the entire body. Everything in the body is made up of cells. So if the cells are dysfunctioning, then the body's not going to work right, and the brain in particular is not going to work right. So Lastly, all of these changes would be expected to affect mitochondrial function, mitochondria being the power plants of the cell. And mitochondrial dysfunction has been shown to be a common mechanism in autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, and a lot of other conditions for that matter. So that's kind of a broad overview of what I think the most likely contributing factors are to ADHD at this point in our understanding. We could think of it as a kind of gut-brain disorder, really, and that's turning out to be true for a lot of behavioral and even psychiatric conditions like depression, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, even Parkinson's and Alzheimer's now are increasingly thought to have a gut-brain element. So this is not too surprising given what we've come to understand in terms of the gut-brain axis, which I've been talking about for many years. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can just search for Kresser gut-brain axis and you'll find a lot of stuff come up there. Let's talk a little bit about what to consider from a practical perspective for ADHD. Unfortunately, I can't provide a protocol because the etiology of ADHD is multifactorial, which means it can have many different causes in different patients. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's been hard to study is this paradigm of conventional medicine is like one disease, one cause. And if you can't find a single cause to the disease, then we don't know what the cause is, which is ridiculous, of course. Most diseases have many different causes, and those causes can be different in different people. And that's something that the conventional medicine paradigm just doesn't get. And it's one of the reasons why functional medicine is so much more effective for addressing chronic disease. And you're going to see why when I read this list. So on the one hand, it's not greatest news because it's not easy. I can't just give everybody a protocol that's going to work for ADHD for every kid and adult that has it because, like I said, the causes are different. But on the other hand, the good news is that all of these fundamental factors which can contribute to ADHD are things that need to be investigated and addressed for optimal health and lifespan and health span anyhow. And they're things that can be addressed in many cases without taking drugs that can alter brain chemistry and have a number of other negative side effects. So there's actually a promise here of correcting the underlying cause of the problem and being able to fix it without drugs or without psychoactive drugs that can have some pretty significant and sometimes long-lasting side effects. So the first thing to look at, of course, would be nutrient status, and that means ensuring a nutrient-dense diet, adequate amounts of zinc, copper, choline, B12, iron, folate, vitamin A. Adequate vitamin D status is crucial, and sometimes that can be achieved with diet, but in other cases, supplementation will be necessary or sun exposure. There are, even in the conventional world, they've recognized that toxic exposure is a contributor to ADHD, and there's certainly plenty of research to support that. So reducing exposure to toxins in food and in the environment in general, and then implementing some safe detox and making sure the detox systems are working properly is very important. And I recently wrote an article with a lot of information about how to do that, and we'll provide a link to that article in the show notes. I would also test any kid who's dealing with ADHD. I would test them for heavy metals, particularly mercury, arsenic, and lead, and cadmium can be contributors, and they're unfortunately high levels in kids are quite common. So we'd want to identify those and get those out if possible. The gut microbiome, of course, becomes a major focus for all of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. We know that disrupted gut microbiome can cause a lot of adverse effects in the brain. And one of them that I mentioned was an increase in propionic acid. So we want to identify potential issues like fungal overgrowth, parasites, bacterial pathogens, and SIBO and treat those. We want to make sure that the patient's consuming plenty of fermented foods and fermentable fibers. And specifically, we want to look at the balance of short-chain fatty acids. So if butyrate levels are low, which they often are in these kids, and propionic acid levels are high, which, by the way, are somewhat difficult to measure. There's some stool tests that do measure production of these things, but it's imperfect. So in a lot of kids who have these conditions, we kind of just assume that propionic acid production might be elevated. And we want to do things like all of the things that we talk about to fix the gut: broth and nutrient-dense diet, fermentable fibers, fermented foods, etc., to shore up the gut flora and increase butyrate production. Specifically, prebiotics are important for promoting butyrate because they feed the beneficial bacteria that produce butyrate, like bifidobacteria. Probiotics also can play a role, but I would say prebiotics are arguably more important in these cases as a way of increasing butyrate. Also, you can supplement with butyrate. Up until very recently, butyrate supplements have not been all that effective, especially oral supplements, because they tend to just dissolve in the stomach and not make it to the colon where they're needed. We have recommended butyrate enemas for some patients in some cases, and that's more effective because the butyrate's getting to the colon where it's needed, but that can be problematic for a number of reasons. There's a new form of butyrate that's coming out soon, a supplemental oral butyrate that's encapsulated in such a way where it is released in the colon where it should be released. It's a molecular trap. It was created by Al Sapp, who was the founder of Thorne, which is a great supplement company. He's no longer with Thorne, but his company now is called TessMed, TESSMED. You can find out more about them at tessmed.com. I don't have any affiliation with them. I'm just excited about their delivery technology, and I've been experimenting with their butyrate with some patients, and it does seem to have a significantly better impact than other forms of butyrate that we've used in the past. We want to reduce exposure to antibiotics as much as possible. Of course, antibiotics can be life-saving and necessary, so I'm not suggesting they should never be used, but I'm suggesting that they should be used judiciously and wisely. Things like ear infections, doctors may often prescribe antibiotics, but if you look at the research on ear infections, many of them are viral and many of them are self-limiting, which means they'll heal with or without antibiotics at the same rate. And we can provide a link to some podcasts or articles I've written on that in the past. There are a lot of childhood health issues that can be resolved without antibiotics, even though antibiotics are often prescribed. I mentioned that acetaminophen exposure has been linked with autism spectrum disorders and ADHD. It's been associated with, prenatal exposure to acetaminophen has been associated with hyperkinetic and ADHD disorders. There's a lot of somewhat disturbing evidence around this, and maybe I'll cover it more specifically in a future podcast or article, because acetaminophen is obviously widely used in obstetrics and pediatric medicine. It may be worth trying more specifically above and beyond just a nutrient-dense diet, a GAPS or ketogenic type of diet. In some cases, I think with ADHD, you get a disrupted gut microbiota that's producing these chemicals that affects brain function, and restricting carbohydrate and particularly starch can be very helpful in resetting the gut microbiota and reducing the production of these chemicals. You'd want to do that under the supervision of somebody who knows how to work with these diets, probably, because there are some other considerations with kids where you want to make sure that they're getting all of the nutrients that they need and you're doing it in a way that's safe. Another important factor would be to support the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, often kind of referred to as the adrenals. So circadian entrainment is important with kids as well as adults, which means not getting too much exposure to light at night, not using their iPad in bed, for example, before they fall asleep, keeping the phone out of the room, making sure they get exposure to bright light during the day, not spending too much time indoors, managing their stress. So helping them to find techniques like deep relaxation techniques or others that can help reduce stress. Kids are under a lot of stress, especially in this day and age, and especially as they get into their teenage years. And we often forget that that's very important for kids as well as adults. Stress is one of the biggest risk factors for mitochondrial dysfunction, which, as I mentioned, is an issue in many of these cases. We want to look at Other ways of improving mitochondrial function, certainly everything that I've mentioned so far is important for mitochondrial function. We also want to test for any infections that might be present and treat those. So that could be any viral infections or reactivated viral infections like Epstein-Barr, or tick-borne illnesses like Lyme or Bartonella or Babesia if they've had exposure. We want to look at methylation, test for methylation and treat that, preferably with diet if possible, but sometimes methyl donor supplementation may be required. And then in some cases, if addressing all of that, the mitochondrial function is still impaired, we might want to consider supplements like CoQ10, ubiquinol, PQQ, creatinine, L-carnitine, B vitamins, all of these things which are collectively referred to as a mitochondrial cocktail. And then finally, it's sometimes helpful to do more advanced genetic testing where you look at genes, genomics, I should say, is really the best way of approaching it. Genetics looks at single genes and their function, but genomics looks at the relationship between all of the genes. And then, epigenetics is looking at the expression of those genes. So in some cases, we want to look at the genomic environment, see what kind, polymorphisms they have in various genes that are known to influence brain function and be related to ADHD, and that can help direct some of the diet and supplement and lifestyle choices. So as you can see, there's a lot to consider and a lot to look at here, but I would really to summarize, focus in on nutrients, the gut, and mitochondrial function, and really direct most of your efforts there. And as you can probably gather, doing this work with a practitioner that has an understanding of these systems and how to test for and treat the issues that would show up is going to, probably produce the best results. But there's a lot you can do on your own. Hopefully some of the ideas I've shared so far will give you a good head start, and you can make some progress that way even without working with a practitioner. Okay, hope this was helpful, Tiffany, and anyone else has ADHD or has kids with ADHD. It's something I'm really passionate about, helping kids with these conditions, because it's just heartbreaking to me that today is the first generation of kids that are expected to live shorter lifespans than their parents, and that's on us. We need to do everything we can to protect the health of future generations and make sure our kids have as high a quality of life and as long of a lifespan as possible. So again, hope that was helpful. Please keep sending your questions in to chriskresser.com/podcast question, and I will talk to you next time. Thanks again, everybody, for listening. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.